Hey friends, Dr. Babb here. I'm going to take a little deviation from my normal OBGYN topics today and discuss something that affects roughly 1 in 8 women in the United States, and probably more across the world. That is thyroid disease. Now, you may be wondering, why do I, as a gynecologist, have anything to say about thyroid disease? And I will tell you, outside of my normal reproductive specialty, thyroid disease is probably the most common thing that I see. So it's everywhere, and if you don't know what to look for, you're going to miss something. So today I'm going to start a new video segment called Looking Beyond the Labs, and we're going to start off with thyroid disease. Now, I posed this question on my Facebook page. Do you think, or would you be interested in a thyroid discussion? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. So many people had questions about different types of thyroid disorders themselves, or what labs you use, or kind of things along that line. And so I thought I'd really break this down into a two-part section to really delve into the heart of this really common problem. So today in part one, I'm really going to be talking about thyroid function, what happens when it goes wrong, what the certain laboratory tests are that can diagnose thyroid disease, and some things to kind of consider along that line. And in the next section, I am going to look at actual thyroid diseases specifically, and also answer any questions that you may have. So if there's something you really want to know or have some burning desire, please send me a message or post either on my YouTube channel here, or you can find me at Dr. Babb on Facebook and post a question or suggestion there. So we're going to start with the basics. What is the thyroid gland and what does it do? Well, the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland that's located kind of here in your neck, right here. It has 4 smaller glands on it called the parathyroid glands, which we'll talk about probably at some other time. As for its function, it's one of the body's main moderators for metabolism. It also does things like help control your heart rate, digestive function, brain development. There are a bunch of other things that it kind of has its hands in. But the main correlation is cellular metabolism, or cellular growth and death, and how those things all work together. A lot of people have a kind of a very vague idea about what the thyroid does. And they know that, well, if you have a low thyroid, then maybe you're going to gain weight, or you may be fatigued, or things kind of along those lines. But it's actually a lot more complex than that. And the things that it does, not only to our weight and our energy levels, are pretty amazing. So if you were to go to a healthcare provider and say, hey, I think there's a problem with my thyroid, they may ask you questions like, well, do you feel really fatigued? Do you feel like your energy level's really low? Are you gaining? Are you losing weight? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel depressed? What's your hair like? Is it growing? Is it falling out? What about your eyebrows? Are they changing? There's a whole list of different symptoms that go along with thyroid disease, and I'm actually going to put a list of them up on the screen here that you can see. And I'll start off with symptoms of hyperthyroidism, or when you have too much thyroid hormone, and I'll follow that by symptoms of hypothyroidism. We'll talk about each of those, independently, but here's kind of an overarching list of what those symptoms are and common ways that they manifest, so you can see if, any of these symptoms match up with maybe what you're experiencing today. So we need to really look at the actual function of the thyroid itself to understand those different conditions like I talked about before, and how those symptoms play out. So the thyroid produces a hormone called thyroxine. And thyroxine is what's called prohormone, meaning it's not really biologically active when it's produced. The production of the thyroxine is really dependent upon the bioavailability of iodine in the body. Now, in the United States, we get a lot of our iodine from salt. You may see, especially if you see some Morton salt, it will say iodinized salt or things like that. You can also get it from other dietary sources, such as shellfish or certain vegetables. But it's that iodine that helps the thyroid actually produce thyroxine in any major amount. In other parts of the world, there's a substantial amount of iodine deficiency. So, if you go to different parts of the world and you were to go to a medical clinic there, you might see them actually prescribing iodine pills or supplements to help relieve some of those thyroid symptoms. Now, thyroxine is labeled as T4 in a lot of our medical literature or in labs or things like that. And like I said, it is a prohormone, so it's not really active, but through a process within the liver, it gets converted to T3 by the removal of a iodine group from that prohormone. And T3, or triiodothyronine, is an incredibly potent metabolic hormone. And it goes around in the body and tells all the different cells that are affected by it to do their thing. When most people have low thyroid, what they're experiencing is a deficiency in that T3 of either getting to the cells, or they're having a decreased production of those or of that hormone, so that the cells are deficient in receiving it. A lot of the medications then that we use to help low thyroid diseases like Hashimoto's or things like that work on either T3 or T4 depending on which medication we're talking about. Now, the thyroid works in what's called a negative feedback system, which means that certain receptors within the body say, oh, I'm getting enough T3, and so it sends a signal back up to the brain to say, hey, you need to tell the thyroid it doesn't really need to produce anymore. The brain sends out a hormone called TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, from the pituitary gland to tell the thyroid itself either increase your production or not. One of the most common laboratory tests that we see in testing for thyroid disorders, therefore, is a measurement of that thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And while that can be helpful in certain instances, it's unfortunately being used as more of a blanket test. You know, they're saying, oh, you have thyroid function problems, let's automatically check your TSH. And the problem with that is that there are certain disorders that they're not going to have an issue with the TSH. You know, the brain may be registering that it's getting enough thyroid from parts of the body maybe incorrectly, or certain other conditions such as really high levels of stress, some issues with diabetes, things along those lines actually send hormones that look very similar to TSH. And so you may actually have ladies that have a substantial problem with their thyroid, but who have normal levels of TSH. So a good way to think about this is to use the analogy of a furnace in your house. You know, it's winter right now, it's cold, I think it works, whatever, we'll go with it. So let's say that you are cold. Let's say that your house is cold, whatever it may be. And so what happens is you go over to your thermostat, which, you know, in this case we'll say is the pituitary gland, and you point the upward temperature level on your thermostat, and it sends a signal to the furnace, which in this case is your thyroid gland, and it says, hey, produce more heat or send out more hormone level. So it does that, and let's say after a little bit you're getting pretty hot. You say, well, that's kind of enough, I don't need any more. And so you go back over to the thermostat and you put the little down arrow down, so it turns down the heat. The thermostat then sends a signal to the furnace and says, we don't need any more heat anymore, and it goes and turns off the heat. That's kind of how a negative feedback cycle works. Once you get a certain amount of hormone or whatever it may be, there are regulatory systems within the body to shut it off. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the other lab tests that people can sometimes order. When we're looking at thyroid disease as a potential autoimmune disorder, and what I mean by that is a problem in which the body attacks itself, so it's an autoimmune response. There are a couple of other immunoglobulins or signs of inflammation that we can look at. One is what's called a thyroid peroxidase, or a TPO. Thyroid peroxidase we'll sometimes see elevated in a condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which we'll talk about a lot in the part 2 of this video. One of the other kind of autoimmune markers we can look at for Hashimoto's or for low thyroid along those lines is what's called an anti-thyroglobulin antibody. Those two together, if you look at them, if they're really elevated, what that means is that the body is attacking the thyroid itself, and so the thyroid gland may not be functioning in a way that is productive. Now, another antibody that we can look at, in more so in the case of hyperthyroid or overactive thyroid, is what's called the TSI, or thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. That basically is a sign that the thyroid is overproducing thyroid hormone. And so those patients have, rapid heart rate, they'll have really increased metabolic rate, they'll be hot all the time. Basically, it's like if in our furnace analogy, the furnace was going out of control and just blowing hot air all the time. So you really have to look at these different antibodies too to get a full picture of what the thyroid is doing. Now, there are a couple of other lab values that aren't checked a lot, but I still feel that need to be mentioned. Number one is looking at what's called the reverse T3. Now, basically, when T4 gets broken down into T3, you've got this kind of free T3, there we go, and then you have reverse T3, and those make up total T3 together. Now, free T3 is biologically active, and your body uses it really well. Reverse T3 basically looks very similar to T3 to the cells in your body, but when it goes and plugs those receptors, it's kind of a dud. It doesn't really do anything. Unfortunately, the body says, oh, here's some T3, it's coming along, and so it sends that signal back up to the brain saying, hey, you don't need to be producing any more thyroid gland or thyroid hormone, I'm good down here, which tells the thyroid gland itself, to kind of shut down production. So you'll sometimes see ladies or men that may have normal lab values that still have really significant hypothyroid symptoms. And if you don't measure the reverse T3, you're actually going to miss a lot of those abnormalities. Now, if you go to a healthcare provider and you get these labs checked, you may have encountered a debate about whether the use of serum or blood lab values or salivary or kind of mouth swab lab values are better. Each kind of have their own camp, and each have their own, research to back them up. I am not an endocrinologist, so I'm not going to kind of get into that debate. I will say, though, that a lot of the salivary testings have not been approved for routine use by the FDA. So if you think that the FDA has anything to do with that, you can make your own decision, but just be aware you may encounter those two ways of testing for thyroid production and usage. Okay, so what can we do about it? Now, like I said, I'm not going to get into specific diseases with this segment, but I do want you to know that if you are suffering from, any of those symptoms like I listed before, and I'm going to put them up again, just so you can kind of have an idea, just know that there are things that can be done. So let's start off with low thyroid or hypothyroidism. First of all, autoimmune thyroiditis, normally called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, basically can be treated with a few ways. Number one, you can try and reduce the inflammation to the gland itself, or number two, you can try and replace the hormones that are not being produced. So in ways of reducing inflammation, first of all, we know that selenium has really been found to be beneficial in helping restore or repair autoimmune thyroid damage. We also know that anti-inflammatory diets can be really beneficial in helping ladies and men that have thyroid problems as well. Obviously, the thought behind that is if you have a chronically inflamed body, then it's going to increase the amount of overall inflammation, which is therefore going to affect your thyroid gland itself. Now, on the medication side of things, we have a couple of different ones that we routinely use, the most common being Synthroid. And Synthroid, otherwise known as levothyroxine, is basically synthetic T4. Now, if you are the type of person that has a low production of T4, like if you don't have enough iodine or things like that, then Synthroid is a great choice for you. The other thing about Synthroid is that it's pretty easy to dose and it's pretty easy to prescribe because it allows your body to kind of break it down into what it needs. Now, certain people, though, won't benefit as well from Synthroid, and so there are some other medications that we use that work actually on T3, one of the most common ones being Armour Thyroid or Armourthroid. That is actually T3 in its most basic form. And so if you're the type of person that has a difficult time converting T4 to T3, or you have a large amount of reverse T3 that's there, actually getting supplementation by something like Armour Thyroid may be a good choice for you as well. Now, for patients who have hyperthyroidism, there are a couple of different medications that we use, the two most commonly being either PTU or propylthiouracil or methimazole. Those work on different ways on the actual thyroid molecules themselves that basically go and prevent the body from producing and utilizing a lot of the thyroid hormone it has. That said, those two drugs do have the potential for pretty substantial side effects, so you definitely need to be under the care of a well-trained provider if you're going to get prescribed those medications. Some of the other ways that we treat hyperthyroidism are by treating the symptoms. So if you have, let's say, a rapid heart rate, you could go on a medication that stops your heart from beating so fast. Or if you have anxiety, you could go on an anti-anxiety medication, things like that. Regardless, if there is a form of autoimmune thyroid disease that you're suffering from, you really should be considering doing things to reduce your overall inflammation and potentially considering increasing things like selenium to help kind of fight that immune response to the thyroid itself. Well, friends, that about wraps up part 1 of this video. I'd love to include part 2 in it, but then the video would be crazy long. So I hope that you'll understand, and I hope that you enjoyed kind of looking a little bit deeper beyond the labs into thyroid disease and how we treat it and kind of the thought behind it. Obviously, if you have any questions or concerns, like I said before, either leave a comment here or send me a message at Dr. Corey Babb on Facebook. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you like my channel. You can do so right there. And if you do like it, please hit that bell to subscribe. Otherwise, I'm Dr. Corey Babb. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.